The pale glow of dusk settled over Briar's Rest, where tombstones stood like crooked teeth amid wild tangles of bramble and ivy. Shadows gathered in the hollows and cracks, weaving through the graves like whispers long since silenced. Astrid shivered as she crossed the overgrown path into the graveyard, its iron gate creaking behind her as if to trap her in. This cursed place held her family's darkest secret, a blood pact with witches long dead, their spirits rumoured to haunt the grounds with whispers that only the cursed could hear. She clutched her lantern tightly, its light flickering against the encroaching darkness as the weight of the generations-old curse settled on her shoulders. Beside her, Sable stepped cautiously, his sharp eyes scanning the rows of headstones as if expecting an apparition to rise at any moment. Sable's presence was a comfort, his quiet resolve reassuring, though even he couldn't mask his unease here. They both knew what lay beneath the ground, the bones of ancestors bound by a pact of vengeance, a curse that could not be broken. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and decay, and each breath felt like inhaling whispers too faint to decipher, yet too chilling to ignore. The graveyard seemed to close in around them, as if urging them deeper to places untouched by light or life. Corin, the youngest and most skeptical of the three, trailed behind, his expression one of forced bravado. To him, this was just an old graveyard filled with family legends, the kind of stories meant to scare children. But even he couldn't deny the uneasy prickling of the skin at the back of his neck, the sense that they were not alone. Despite his skepticism, Corin couldn't shake the feeling that eyes watched them from beyond the veil of shadows, unseen yet ever present. He kept his voice low, his bravado slipping as he muttered, "Are we sure this curse even exists? Or is it just one of those tales meant to keep us in line?" Astrid glanced back at him, her face solemn. "The curse is real, Corin. I've heard them, the whispers." She faltered, her voice trailing off as a chilling breeze passed through the graveyard, rustling the leaves like faint laughter. Briar's Rest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, an ancient heartbeat that spoke to the blood pact and the endless cycles of fate. Astrid had seen the strange symbols, the rituals left by those before her who had attempted to break the curse, all to no avail. The blood pact demanded more than sacrifice. It demanded loyalty and obedience to an agreement that no living soul could remember, but all felt bound to uphold. As they reached the heart of the graveyard, a towering tree loomed ahead, its gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers over a cluster of graves. Astrid's gaze fell on one headstone in particular, marked with symbols she couldn't decipher, symbols her ancestors had carved to honor the witches who had cast the original curse. Her breath caught as she sensed the weight of generations pressing upon her, binding her to this place and to the whispers that would forever call her back. She knew, as they all did, that escape was impossible. The curse would continue, bound to the bloodline that had dared make a pact with the grave. As they ventured deeper into the graveyard, Astrid felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them, watching from the shadows. She could swear she heard faint whispers echoing through the trees, ancient voices muttering secrets she wasn't meant to know. Each step she took seemed to sink further into Briar's Rest, as if the earth itself sought to pull her in. Sable walked beside her, his fingers tracing the rusted symbols on a grave marker. "These carvings," he murmured. "They're like a language I can almost understand, but not quite. It's as if they were written for us, yet meant to be indecipherable." Corin, still skeptical but visibly unsettled, tried to shake off the chill. He laughed nervously, the sound too loud against the eerie quiet. "Maybe the witches just wanted to scare people off. It's a good trick for keeping grave robbers away." But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed him, darting back and forth as though he feared he'd see something lurking between the gravestones. His footsteps faltered as they approached a shadowed corner of the graveyard, where a ring of headstones circled a small patch of untouched earth. Astrid recognized it as the witches' gathering spot, a place her family was warned never to disturb. Without thinking, Astrid stepped into the center of the ring, feeling a strange warmth underfoot as if the earth was alive beneath her. Sable and Corin exchanged uneasy glances but followed her lead, drawn by a force neither could understand. A light mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around them, weaving through their fingers like spectral threads. The mist thickened, and in the silence, faint laughter echoed around them, distorted and unsettling. Astrid's heart raced as she heard the whispers more clearly now, their words forming fragments of an ancient incantation, a reminder that the blood pact was eternal. Sable reached out, his hand hovering over Astrid's shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't be here. This place, it's alive." But Astrid was transfixed, staring at the ground beneath her feet where faint lines appeared, forming the shape of an ancient rune. The rune pulsed faintly, a heartbeat in the earth, and she realized it was part of the blood pact, carved by her ancestors to mark their binding with the witches. The whispers grew louder, enveloping her, warning her that once a bloodline was bound, there was no way to undo it. She felt a sense of resignation in the voices, a warning from those who had tried and failed. Corin, finally shaken to his core, reached for Astrid's arm, his face pale. "Astrid, let's go. This isn't a storybook curse. These voices, they're alive." But even as they turned to leave, the shadows around them grew thicker, forming tendrils that seemed to reach out, trying to hold them back. The graveyard was not ready to release them, and the pact, bound to their very blood, would not let them forget. Astrid's gaze fell on Sable, a realization settling over her. This curse, passed down through generations, would haunt them forever, never allowing them to escape the pact forged here in Briar's Rest. As Astrid and her companions stood within the ring of graves, the air grew thick with an unnatural stillness, the mist now swirling faster, binding itself around their legs like ghostly chains. She could feel the energy of the curse rising, pressing down on her chest, each breath growing heavier, weighted by the whispers of long-dead witches. The ground began to tremble beneath them, and a chill seeped into her bones, as if she herself were becoming one with the cursed soil of Briar's Rest. In that moment, she realized this was no ordinary curse. It was a hunger, a living force that demanded her submission. Suddenly, the runes on the ground flared to life, casting an eerie glow that stretched across the graveyard like veins of fire. The whispers intensified, overlapping one another, until they formed a single commanding voice that echoed in her mind. "The pact cannot be broken." Astrid felt a pull at the edge of her consciousness, a tug from something beyond this world, urging her to surrender. Sable's voice broke through the haze, his hand gripping her arm. "Astrid, fight it!" he shouted, his voice filled with both determination and desperation, as if he too felt the graveyard's grip tightening. Corin, his skepticism now shattered, staggered back, his face pale as he watched shadows emerge from behind the gravestones. These shadows, once only flickering movements, now coalesced into figures. Ghostly apparitions dressed in tattered garments, their eyes hollow yet brimming with an eternal hunger. They were the ancestors, bound by the curse, guardians of the blood pact who had once dared to challenge the witches. They glided forward, their spectral forms whispering in unison, as if pleading or warning. "You are ours," they chanted, their voices low and haunting, a twisted lullaby that echoed through the graveyard. Astrid's mind raced, and a single terrifying thought emerged. There was no escape from Briar's Rest. The curse was not a simple punishment, but a binding, tethering her soul and the souls of her family to this land forever. She tried to break free, but the ground beneath her seemed to pull her down, a living force that refused to let her go. Sable struggled beside her, and for a moment she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, his resolve unwavering. But as he reached for her, the apparitions surged forward, their ghostly hands reaching out as if to reclaim him. Just as Astrid felt herself slipping away, surrendering to the graveyard's pull, she cried out, "We are not yours!" Her voice echoed against the stillness, and for a moment the graveyard hesitated, as if surprised by her defiance. But the silence was short-lived. The shadows closed in, the runes flaring brighter, binding them all to the graveyard's will. The pact could not be broken, and with one final surge the whispers ceased, leaving only a chilling silence. Briar's rest would keep its bloodline, bound to an eternity of whispers and shadows. The graveyard fell silent as the whispers ceased, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Astrid's heart pounded as she looked at her companions, the fear in their eyes mirroring her own. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, as if Briar's rest itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to acknowledge what had just transpired. The cursed graveyard had claimed its hold on them, each of them marked by the blood pact they could never escape. Astrid's hand instinctively went to her chest, as though she could feel the chains of the curse tightening around her heart. Sable's gaze remained fixed on the ground where the glowing runes had flickered and died. He seemed distant, his eyes dark with realization. "We're bound to this place, aren't we?" he murmured, barely more than a whisper. It was not a question. It was a statement, a truth that needed no confirmation. The pact, formed generations ago, was as alive as the spirits within Briar's rest. Astrid could see the weight settling on his shoulders, the acceptance of a fate he had tried so hard to deny. Corin, shaken but defiant, paced in the shadow of the ancient tree, his footsteps crunching the fallen leaves. "This can't be it," he muttered, his voice breaking the silence. "There has to be a way to end this curse. We don't have to be tied here like prisoners." But his words fell flat, the emptiness of the graveyard swallowing his determination. Even as he spoke, the ground beneath them seemed to pulse, as if Briar's rest was laughing softly, amused by his futile rebellion. The pact was more than a curse. It was a claim, one that bound them to the graveyard in both life and death. Astrid felt a wave of sorrow wash over her, an aching grief for the ancestors who had once stood in this very spot, their lives consumed by a pact they couldn't escape. She wondered if they too had once believed they could break free, only to find themselves bound tighter with each attempt. The ghosts of Briar's rest had tried to warn them, to show them the futility of resistance. As she looked around at the graves that would one day claim her family's bones, she felt a grim acceptance settle in her heart. They were part of this place now, forever tied to its whispers and shadows. The three of them lingered a moment longer, the silence pressing in like a shroud, the truth of the curse sinking into their bones. With heavy hearts they turned back, leaving the graveyard behind but knowing it would follow them wherever they went. The pact could not be broken, but it had chosen to remain quiet, its whispers fading as they left Briar's rest. Astrid glanced back one last time, the twisted branches of the ancient tree casting shadows like skeletal fingers reaching out. She knew, as they all did, that they would return, drawn back to the graveyard by the Pact's silent demand. Days passed, but Briar's rest lingered in Astrid's mind like a dark cloud she couldn't escape. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every whisper in the wind seemed to carry a faint echo of the graveyard's haunting lullaby. The knowledge of the Pact's permanence weighed heavily on her, a constant reminder that her bloodline would never be free. It was as though Briar's rest itself had woven into the very fabric of her soul, binding her to its soil as surely as the roots that twisted beneath the ground. Sable, too, had felt the change. He carried an unspoken understanding, his gaze often distant as he looked toward the horizon, as if searching for a way to break free that he knew he'd never find. The curse had claimed him just as it had the ancestors buried in that silent graveyard. Each night, he'd awaken to dreams of the graveyard, of the symbols on the ground that seemed to pulse in his memory, whispering in the voices of the dead. The pact was as much a part of him now as his own heartbeat. Corin, though resistant, had finally succumbed to the truth. He'd stopped speaking of escape, his defiance replaced with a resigned silence. Briar's Rest was no ordinary place. It was a part of them, of their family's history, and it demanded their loyalty. With every step he took away from the graveyard, he felt its pull, a magnetic force that would always draw him back. The land of the cursed was now in his veins, a quiet reminder that his fate was sealed. Together they visited Briar's Rest one final time, feeling the weight of their family's legacy pressed down on them with every step. The graveyard lay in wait, the mist curling around them in a familiar embrace, as if welcoming them home. Astrid felt a bittersweet acceptance fill her heart. This was her place, her destiny, bound to the earth of Briar's Rest. She glanced at Sable and Corin, their expressions mirroring her own resignation. They were one with the land now, with the pact that would echo through generations yet to come. As they left the graveyard in silence, each of them knew they'd return, drawn back by the unbreakable pact. Briar's Rest was patient, its whispers a lullaby that would call to them always. They could not escape it. The blood pact would remain, an eternal bond that would never release them. With the final rays of dusk fading behind them, Astrid looked back one last time. The twisted branches of the ancient tree seemed to wave in farewell, their skeletal fingers reaching into the night, reminding her that Briar's Rest was not just a place, it was home.